Yes, good morning, everyone, and very much welcome to another Flash Friday. My name is Ginsel from Holland FinTech, and I'm happy to take you through the news and developments in FinTech today, as every week I do on the Friday morning. And of course, I do that with a distinguished guest. And today I have the honor to have with me Paul Scholten, the CEO of Buckaroo. Good morning, Paul.
Thank you very much, Don, and good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Very nice to see you here, and I'm very much looking forward to talk with you through the news and see where things are heading within the whole payments and fintech space, where of course where you're active. For our listeners, I'm happy to take your questions. So please type your comments in the chat if you have any. We're happy to see if we can weave them into our story. And for the rest, of course, should you be more interested in the news that we're discussing today, please check out the Global FinTech newsletter via the Holland FinTech website. It gets sent out every Friday afternoon. So after those household measures, Paul, let's dive in a little bit more about what you do. You're the CEO of Buckaroo, I think a payment powerhouse, quite active across Europe. Tell us a little bit more about what you do and where you're heading with Buckaroo.
Okay. Very quick description of Buckaroo. We, as you said, one of the leading PSPs in the Netherlands. And what does a PSP do? A PSP deals primarily with corporates, which can be in a corporate active in e-commerce or can be a different corporate. We handle, at this point in time, online payments. We mostly deal in B2C payments. In other words, if a e-commerce company collects money from its customers, we handle that for different payment methods. So we're dealing with Ideal, we're dealing with credit cards, we're dealing with bankcontact. We have around 3,000 customers, primarily Dutch and Belgian customers. 500 of those are top and mid-market customers. So we're dealing with the National Lottery, Swapfiets for the subscriptions, Videoland, also for subscriptions, Decathlon, Maxeda, where you can imagine that at this point in time, because of COVID and the fact that the non-essential shops are still more or less closed, our volumes are doing pretty well. We've actually had a pretty good year in 2020. It's hard to say that because we have a relatively limited exposure to travel. And we're actually mostly active in retail, fashion, and interestingly enough, also in some value-added services like subscription management, as I mentioned, Swapfiets. Swapfiets has its bikes. We handle the subscriptions. We handle the SEPA direct debits that are related to it. We actually make sure that if a payment does not come through, we send the reminders and we follow up on that sense. So that's the subscription management part. We also have launched recently a marketplace offering for split payments. Well, that's going pretty well. I think there's a lot of interest in there. It's very, it's a part of the market, the e-com market, which is developing quite rapidly. So we're moving into that as well. Our motto is that we work together with our customers and partners to enable growth. Growth, obviously, of the customers and partners and growth of ourselves. And we do that through consultancy. So we advise customers on how to put in place the best payment approach and the best payment strategy. And we do that by providing additional service. So on the implementation side, also on the customer service sides, we follow up with the customers pretty well.
I have a question about that, Paul. So, because what I see is a lot of payment service providers are actually sort of moving forward towards the front end of e-commerce. So I see them basically trying to also get closer to involved in the whole conversion cycle between website visitors and how much transactions in the end up in the payment flow. Is that also part of your consultancy, or how far does your role go basically in your collaboration?
Well, in that sense, for instance, to give an example, we have a smart checkout. And the smart checkout is primarily geared towards ensuring that the conversion rate is higher. We work together with our customers to ensure that obviously conversions are at the right level. We provide for customers that don't have their own checkout, a smart checkout, which automatically selects the payment methods which the customer has already selected in the past. So it's easier. So in that sense, we're also moving up in the payment chain. We are also, and I think that's something that we do through value-added services. If you, as you rightly say, the subscription management is clearly something where we don't only do the payments, but we also do the part before that. In other words, the subscription management, you have a subscription management engine, so we can handle that as well. And we obviously also do the part after that. In other words, if payments have not been executed for whatever reason, we can follow up with the consumers to make sure that they have another possibility to pay either through Ideal or in a different manner. So in that sense, we try to become more active, not only purely on the payment side, but also in terms of the subscription management, marketplaces, and credit management. We're not at this point in time going into developing our own web shops, because we consider that's the business of our partners. However, we're trying to get more and more, I would say, partnerships with independent software providers, because we think that's one of the directions that the market is taking, and we'll come to that afterwards a bit in the discussion about the payment environment.
I'm also curious, Paul, about the subscription based, right? So the sort of the membership oriented commerce or subscription commerce. Do you see that that's still growing a lot? Is there still a lot of appetite for these subscriptions? Because it was, let's say, last year and the year before, it was quite popular. But I'm really curious also whether you see that growing still.
We do see it growing still. I'll put it this way: there was obviously a hype about everything was going to be moving to a subscription based. Well, that's obviously not the case. However, we do see that a lot of our customers start offering, alongside their normal sales activities, a subscription based product. We also see that in whole areas, and you talk about mobility, you see that subscription is becoming an essential part of propositions like mobility as a service, doesn't need a subscription model as part of it. So what you see more and more businesses which have subscription either as the core of their business or as an associated part of it, because it essentially retains customers. So is it going to be taking over the entire market? No. Is it an essential part of selling online? Yes. And we do see growth in that area, and we do continue to invest in that and develop that business in the Netherlands, but also outside of the Netherlands. That's one thing that we actually did last year. We decided to focus not only on the Netherlands, but also on Belgium. So we started the sales office in Belgium, which is a different market, but quite similar in terms of technical needs as the Netherlands. And we also decided to take over, as I said, we are at this point in time mostly active in the top end of the market and the mid-market. We decided to acquire CISO, which is a PSP, which is mainly active with smaller merchants, because we also think that because of COVID and also for other reasons, digitalization in that market segment is going well, and there is going to be an increased need for small and medium-sized enterprises to be selling online. So we want to play into that market as well.
I'm also curious about that because I believe that there's a real big gap. We did, for example, a study into financial inclusion in the Dutch market last year, where we also discovered that it's mostly what you see is that, well, of course, everyone technically has access to the same products, but we see especially with SMEs that they don't always make proper use of all the financial tooling that's around. And so do you also see that that's also why it's such a big growth market, that a lot of the smaller entrepreneurs and companies just are not fully optimized the use of basically all the tools that are there, like indeed payment methods or subscription methods for their commerce?
I think there's a specific challenge for small and medium-sized enterprises that they often don't have all the development staff in order to put in place very complex plugins and otherwise. Yep. So there needs to be a fairly intuitive and easy way to log into payment methods and different value-added services. So it's a different approach. So in that sense, we do see it as that's one of the reasons for us to take over CISO. We do think that we have to invest and develop further, and CISO has a specific capability to onboard customers in a very seamless and easy way. They have the ability to provide plugins on a wide range of connectivity with ISVs and different e-com platforms. I think it's a different approach. So we clearly see it. We have our top line and mid-market customers which need a slightly more complex payment products, and we have the SME market which needs, I would say, a payment, still a lot of payment products, but also very much needs to have an easy way of onboarding and a seamless way. It should work, and it should be effective. So in that sense, We clearly see CISO and Buckaroo as targeting slightly different markets. And as you said, one of the preconditions for SME companies to move more into the online sphere is to have easy access and seamless onboarding.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that's really important, and I think it's nice that you have a proposition for that, because I think there's a lot of growth still available. Although indeed, of course, we saw also that especially during COVID, a lot of also smaller companies really had to start experimenting or expanding on their digital channels as well.
Exactly. So you do see them. And I think that will not go away. I think there was a bit of a. I attended a workshop a couple of weeks ago, and there was a discussion about what is going to be happening after COVID. And essentially, it was clear that COVID has had an enormous impact also in the Dutch market. I mean, this was January and February was the first time ever that there was more volume on Ideal than on PIN, which is incredible, because normally it's about 20% Ideal and 80% PIN. The expectation is that a lot of the offline, the in-store business will come back. That's clear. But the expectation is also that there will be an increased part of online activity. I mean, the growth that we've seen online will not totally go away. People have taken up the habit of ordering specific products online. So we do think that in general, at this point in time, online represents about 20% of the market in Europe, and it will be going to 30% plus within a couple of years. And it actually has accelerated because of COVID. But it still means, as you rightly say, if you are an entrepreneur, big or small, you need to be able to handle offline as well as online in a combined fashion.
No, exactly. I think that's still where I'm also really curious how the experience will go, because potentially also offline you could be in an online experience, right? So I think that's also a promise that we've been talking about already for a couple of years on whether, I mean, you could actually work with the online store of the store that you're actually visiting to have access to their full range of basically what they have in their warehouse, and you could just be there to try things and get advice, but you actually can still do the purchase through e-commerce, basically, right? So
exactly.
Making the whole POS obsolete.
It will be a combined offering. Let's put it that way.
Potentially. Yeah. And so let's say maybe to explore a little bit where the payments industry is heading. There's a lot of things, of course, happening in the space of payments. If you talk about on the infrastructure level, like the European Payment Initiative, but also or CDBC discussions, right? Central bank digital currencies, they could all basically change the fundament on what payments are, how they're actually being shaped. But also on the front end side, we see a lot of developments. And one of the things I, for example, also find interesting there is how Google and Facebook actually have struck a deal with media companies in Australia to start paying for consumption of media. I think micropayments have been a promise also for a decade almost, but never really hit it off. So I'm curious if this is, for example, one of the ones that could actually kick that off again. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think you mentioned a couple of subjects. I think if you look at Europe has an interesting challenge because Europe feels a bit threatened by the American giants, be it either the card companies, Visa, MasterCards, or the GAFA, and by the Chinese platforms, Alibaba, Tencent, JD.com. So the European banks and the European Commission are looking at the European Payment Initiative in order to put in place a European alternative on a payment basis, which is very much going to be based on transfers, safer credit transfer to a large extent, but we also have a component in cards. We'll see how that plays out. I think it's going to be interesting for the Netherlands, because obviously the Netherlands, through Ideal, already has quite an effective and efficient payment method, which is SET based, and which is at this point in time covering about 70% of the online market. It could be interesting to see how that evolves in a European context. I think the jury is still out to see to what extent, because it's European Payment Initiative is being borne by 20 large commercial banks with the support of the European Commission. We'll see how that works out, but it is going to be from a payment initiative quite interesting. Another thing which is interesting, and I think a lot of people have not focused on too much, is the fact that we have over the last 2 years seen a combination of Worldline and Ingenico on the one hand, Nexi, SIA and Nets on the other hand. So we've ended up with 2 European giants in payments. And I think that most people don't realize that apart from the big American and US players, big American and Chinese players, we also have 2 fairly large players. They tend to be a bit under the radar, of course, because otherwise people will start noticing them. But they are actually quite sizable, and they will be playing a large role, I think, alongside the banks in defining the payment landscape in the future. You mentioned something about central bank digital currency. Well, that's an interesting one. I saw an article where the Bank of England decided that actually they were thinking about introducing a pilot because they thought that the money had become too privatized. Well, it's an interesting, in other words, money. Yeah. It's an interesting concept. So we are going to be, in a sense, it's true because, of course, in the past, a lot of it was cash, and obviously a lot of the cash will be replaced by electronic means. So that's moving more and more into the private sphere. It's going to be really interesting to see what's going to happen with a blockchain-based central bank digital currency. How is it going to be used? How the bank's going to be playing a role? How the other party's going to be playing a role? It will be a bit further down the road, but it might have major impacts on the way the overall payment landscape is handled. But at this point in time, it's still difficult to see.
No, it's really early on indeed. It's always curious to see how, let's say, I think we've been talking about it already also for a year, and they're just trying to do some experiments now to figure out, but it's still quite a highly defensive move, I think, because there are some market initiatives that might jump into this role.
Right? Yeah, Libra, of course, from Facebook, which triggered a lot of this. But you do see that some of the more, between brackets, the more progressive central banks, like the Bank of England, but also the Central Bank of Sweden, are looking into it. The Central Bank of China is looking into it as well from a different angle. We might be talking a bit about China afterwards. But it will be interesting, but that's going to be a bit further down the road. What you do see at this point in time is you see a number of you see actually the inclusion of payments into other products, and then you talk about independent software vendors, and you see combined offerings, like in the case of a very good example is Shopify, which offers on the one hand an e-com platform, but with an included payment. You also see it in the form of MindBody, which of course is working for the fitness sector. In both cases, I mean, often you see Stripe behind it. Well, it's interesting because Stripe just had a funding round a couple of weeks ago, and it's worth quite a bit of money. So you do see an interesting trend, which is primarily at this point in time in the US, where you see the combination of independent software vendors with a combined payment offering. It's not yet that popular in Europe. In Europe, you still see a distinction between, on the one hand, the ISVs, on the other hand, the PSPs. But it's clearly taking up in the US.
So how do you see that? Indeed, it's interesting that you point out to Stripe, right? I think that's also, again, in the news this week. So what do you think? What is Stripe doing right that they actually get this enormous valuation, even still doing private funding rounds? It's enormous what kind of value gets attached to it.
Well, it's interesting because Stripe, it also goes for a company like SumUp. What actually Stripe did, they very clearly defined what they were going to do in the value chain. And they decided that there will be between the what you call the ISVs, and then they teamed up with Zuora, they teamed up with Shopify, they teamed up with MindBody, and a number of other, quite another ISVs. So they would be between the ISVs and the banks. So that meant that actually they were playing a key role. They were doing the payment product, and they had a total stack of payments, including payment, subscription, marketplaces, treasury services, which they would be putting at the disposal of ISVs.
Yep.
And they would be maintaining the contact with the financial industry, mainly the banks, in order to make sure that these products would be executed. Of course, they started in the SME sector. And at this point in time, they're also moving up. And they're moving into, for instance, treasury management. So what they did well, they had a very clear vision about where they wanted to go. They acted globally.
Yep.
Starting in the US. And as they said, with the funding round of 600 million, they indicated that we're going to spend a lot of money of that in Europe. Well, it's logical because originally they were founded by two Irish brothers. So in that sense, they will have a bit of an interest in Europe. So they were global and they executed well. In other words, they were excellent in partnership management. They were very good in their technology stack.
Yeah. But maybe also interesting to ask here is, right, so I think that they positioned themselves almost as an American company for a very long time, even though indeed they were founded by two brothers from Ireland. Do you also think that actually still an advantage because of the access to, for example, venture capital or the sizability of the market? Do you think that these factors play a role potentially?
I think it definitely helped their initial growth because the American market was much more, I would say, developed in terms of ISVs, and they had the position to play, so they were able. They date back to 2010, so they were able to play this position much more quickly. Europe is a different ballgame. It's a more complex market. The markets are split up. So Europe, no matter what, will be more of a challenge for Stripe because they are actually they developed very well in the US based on a couple of partnerships on a pan-US basis. It's going to be a bit more complex in Europe because you don't have the same level of development of ISVs and ISPs. And it's still a number of different countries. So you still have to develop into different countries, different legal systems. So Europe is, no matter what, more of a challenge for US and Chinese players for that matter.
Yeah. Is this also something that you discussed, for example, with your shareholder, Blackfin Capital, right? So I can imagine that it's also, let's say, influences your own strategy on how you further grow. So curious also what kind of conversation you're having with your investor on this.
Well, it's an interesting question. In fact, to give a bit of background on Buckaroo is owned 100% by Blackfin Capital. They are a French private equity firm, which is what I would say specializing in the financial industry, which is a very important part because they clearly understand the rules and regulations in finance, and they also know that if you need to do something, you have to keep to the rules of the central bank. So that helps quite a bit. They bought Buckaroo and they essentially defined a strategy for growth. So what did we do? We grew in terms of, we initially focused on product range, and we essentially became direct acquirer for Ideal, became direct acquirer for Bankcontact. We became PayVac for credit cards. So that was a product-driven strategy. We moved up in terms of the customer base. So we went more into top line and mid-market. The discussions essentially with them are, on the one hand, very pragmatic. I mean, as I said, they are in the financial industry. They also tend to be in the mid-market companies. So it's a very pragmatic discussion. In other words, what do you do now? What do you do next? As I said, we clearly defined we want to grow, and we decided, okay, we want to grow in the SME market. Conclusion, we acquire CISO. We want to grow geographically. We take one market, we develop it well. And obviously, there is a lot of discussion because they know the market actually quite well. There's a lot of input of what other parties are doing. And as I said, from a competitive point of view, obviously, a discussion about Stripe and a discussion about what else happens in the market is quite relevant. So I think, in a sense, it's always. I mean, if you have a private equity shareholder, obviously, there's always a certain pressure. You have to deliver. That's quite clear. Yeah. That's normal. That's part of the deal. So I wouldn't say it's always a fully comfortable relationship because there's a certain pressure behind it to make sure that you actually deliver the goods. But they're quite realistic, and they set ourselves, I would say, challenging but realistic targets, which is also good because it means you don't have to do things that you should not be doing otherwise. That's always important.
Yeah, exactly. And so what might be interesting as well is that I think that they're based out of France, right? But of course, the France PSP market is also pretty bizarre compared to the, for example, Dutch or Belgian market, because actually there's a lack of a PSP layer because the banks never let go, right? What I know about it. Is that also still, is there potential still there, you think, at some point to actually have a PSP proposition in the market?
I think if you look at it, there is a potential to have a PSP proposition in the market, which could be in cooperation with banks. Because as you rightly say, the French banks were actually quite smart. They realized that this is a strategically important market, and they actually made sure there would be no growth of PSPs by cutting down the prices to such a level that no one could really make money. Which is an interesting strategy. Now, they do realize that they don't have all the technical skills in order to handle a PSP offering for their customers. So it's going to be really interesting to try and look at cooperation with banks and to see whether in that manner PSPs can develop in the French market.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, I think. Yeah, it should be... curious if that's somewhere on your path in the future. In any case, good to have them on board as a good leverage to do that.
They do have quite a few connections in France. That's for sure. One thing we just mentioned about China. Maybe that's one other.
No, exactly. Yeah, we have to keep it a bit brief, but definitely curious about your take on that.
Well, it's actually China is interesting because you have to realize that when Alibaba started. At the end of the 90s, there were only 8 million people on the internet in China. Now, in 20 years, it's the biggest online market in the world. It's actually, I think, except for Amazon, it's far beyond anyone else can do in the combination of a platform with social media, logistics, finance, and e-commerce. It's actually quite impressive. You have a couple of very large players, Alibaba, Tencent, JD.com. And the interesting thing is what happened is, Jack Ma couldn't keep his mouth shut. And that probably was not the only reason. So he had to go into supervised hiding, I think, for a couple of weeks. But the Chinese government actually caught up to the fact that these platforms have so much data on customers and so much power from an economic point of view, and become so big in terms of finance and payments, that the president of China decided that, as he said, he wants to accelerate the rules and regulations for these platform companies, and he wants to make sure that they are reorganized so that the payment and the financial activities are being put into a holding company to be supervised by the central bank. Now, that's interesting from, I would say, a US point of view, because there's exactly the same discussion going on in the US right now. I mean, how do you go about antitrust and the GAFA? It's interesting from a European point of view as well, because a lot of it is around data. I think the president actually mentioned that he wants to have a data property rights system, which is an interesting concept. And it's similar to what the discussion we have in Europe around who owns the data on the consumers.
Around GDPR.
I fear in China, it's not about the consumer, it's more about the state. Because obviously the state would like to get hold of these data.
Slightly different perspective.
Slightly different perspective. The idea is the same. I mean, how do you make sure that these kind of platforms don't fully control the market? So I think in this sense, China...
They really come from a point where they thought that these platforms were actually helping them to expand the Chinese influence, I think, across the world at first. But I think they figured out that they might be just slightly too independent and not in line with what the party wants them to do. Yeah, so I can imagine that. But it's interesting from a European perspective as well, I think, because I think sometimes we look at sort of the combination of e-commerce and the financial function with a bit of jealousy in what kind of customer experience you can actually deliver, right? So, and I think if you look at what consumers want, it's likely that we will move towards such a seamless experience as they are able to offer so far. But I'm curious also what will happen now once indeed these platforms get taken apart and the financial function really gets a separate stream.
Yeah, and it's also interesting. It's the first time that actually China is ahead of the world in this area. So it's quite interesting to look at the Chinese eco market to see what's going to happen elsewhere.
It won't be the last moment, I think, where they will be ahead.
I know.
They're really driven to stay ahead. Yeah,
exactly.
But maybe back, because I think we almost have to wrap it up there, Paul. Just want to basically wrap this up with one last question for you. I think you're based in the Dutch ecosystem, which I think is highly valued for the payment expertise, and we really have a lot of champions in the payment space. Why is that, do you think? What's making this such a special place for payments? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a combination of things. I think it's interesting enough, the entrepreneurial spirit, because a lot of these companies have been founded by entrepreneurs that are still owning the company, or owning part of the company. So that's the first part. It's the natural ability of Dutch to think about trade and think about finance and do something with it. And interestingly enough, it has also been the willingness of the central bank to allow this market to develop, let's say between 2005 and 2011, without, I wouldn't say overly supervising it. So there was a combination of three things. The central DNB actually allowed this market to develop. There was a lot of entrepreneurial spirits. There was an ecosystem which, on the one hand, for payments, and I think we shouldn't underestimate the role of Ideal either. So the banks actually got together, manufactured, between brackets, a payment method which was trusted by the consumers, and thereby generated more growth of the eco market in the Netherlands. And on top of that, obviously, you had the PSPs. So it was a kind of a virtuous circle. And as you rightly say, we have a number of important players, and obviously it also creates quite a bit of competition. But it's as a PSP market, one of the most developed in Europe. Yeah,
I think it's just really interesting always to see how far we are at that level. I think with sort of smoothing out the whole transaction space for especially around e-commerce and in the online world. So I think that's it's quite nice to see that.
But one thing, I think, because I had a discussion last week, and someone said, yes, well, we're far ahead of Europe and blah, blah, blah. We don't have to do much. I said, well, look at what's happening in Scandinavia. Look at what's happening in Belgium. Yes, we are far ahead of anyone. We were far ahead of most of the players in Europe, but we have to keep developing because Scandinavia, Belgium is catching up. And in order to keep our advance, we have to keep developing. So let's not, as you said, rest on our laurels, but let's keep developing something. And that's why I'm quite happy with the initiative like Ideal 2.0, which actually takes the cow with the horns and get something new in place.
Yeah, exactly. I'm looking forward to that as well. So let's dive into that some other time because we really run out of time here, Paul. But I really appreciate the conversation. It was a lot of fun
You're most welcome.
Hear from you, your perspective on Buckaroo and where you see the payment world's heading. So thank you very much for sharing.
You're most welcome.
Yeah, looking forward to see you again soon. For all the listeners, thank you very much for joining in. Looking forward to catch you again next week with a new speaker. Enjoy your weekend, everyone.
Thanks.